Malaket. I'm the president of Opus Advisory Services International based in Canada, and I have the privilege of being the chair of the International and Technical Advisory Committee of the Global Trade Professionals Alliance, the GTPA, which we're here to introduce you to today. The GTPA is a vision and a concept that first originated with the Export Council of Australia, but that will and has already very quickly taken on the character of a global organization around certification and professionalization in the practice of international trade. What we'll do this evening is explore with you the vision and mandate and aspirations of the GTPA on a couple of different dimensions. We'll be thinking about the GTPA in terms of, when you think about what's going on in the world today around international trade, we'll be thinking about the GTPA as a facilitator of thoughtful engagement and advocacy in trade. We'll be talking a little bit about this notion of professionalization, which we'll explain in more detail, but the idea is to really raise the bar on the practice of international trade and all the disciplines related to trade. So that's the professionalization piece. We'll then talk a little bit about the network power of the GTPA, so this idea of a trusted network in international trade, and we'll round out the conversation with a bit of a vision discussion about the fact that we look at trade from very much a holistic perspective. And we'll elaborate on that in the last part of the discussion. This is a small group, so by all means, if we can make it as conversational as we can, by all means interject anytime. If you have any questions or observations that you wish to share with us, please do. And so with that, and by the way, we are standing between you and some cocktails at the end of this session. So if you don't have any prior commitments, please do join us downstairs for a glass of wine and cocktails. So we'll wrap up roughly around 6 o'clock. Thank you for that introduction and that positioning of that discussion around thoughtful engagement, and you took a very practical commercial view looking at it from the perspective of SMEs and what that means. We have folks on the panel with a range of experience, including a couple of policy specialists. Can I open it up for discussion, ladies and gentlemen on the panel, your observations on thoughtful engagement and how GTPA could help support facilitate thoughtful engagement in the world today in the current environment? Anybody care to take a first shot?
I think part of it will be covered in the subsequent sessions, because obviously the key to that is having a set of standards that identifies what professional capabilities are, having the networks that are functioning, active and fully engaged, and particularly in the case of SMEs who struggle to identify and find relative capabilities to their needs. And their needs will change based on the economy they're in, the geography they're in, the size and nature of the business, the industry they're in. And so having that diversity to allow them to find the right capabilities is important. Often, you see these courses that are run and they're Export 101, and they're not targeted to an industry or a market. They're just catch-all through. Obviously, often run by government, not necessarily. Usually, the institutions that deliver more targeted courses, but government often run these sort of catch-all things. And I'm not sure that SMEs get a huge amount of benefit out of that, because they do need targeted education. They do need targeted competencies that fit their need. The other thing on the other side of the ledger, of course, or not the other side of the ledger, but the other side of the scale, is that SMEs are one piece of the world economy and the other piece is large corporates. And most of the large corporates that we've spoken to are fully supportive of engaging SMEs and increasing their capability, because their supply chain is comprised heavily of SMEs. Now, that's both upstream and downstream in the supply chain, so the suppliers and the market. And having that more capable supply chain gives them an opportunity to increase their business. The other thing that the large corporates will tell us is that having a career path mapped out for their juniors. So knowing what their juniors need to do, and then having a model of continuing professional development that actually takes their juniors down a path. And we probably weren't going to touch on it, but I might. Right. So the GTPA has a framework for continuing professional development to try and recognise that as your career maturity changes, then your CPD changes. So if you're early in your career, then you're hungry for skills and knowledge. When you're mid-career, you're usually looking for knowledge updates. But often when you're at the tail end of the career, your CPD is actually not necessarily... Yes, you'll have some information input, but a lot of your CPD or your continuing professional development is actually from engaging others and developing mentorship, developing others, developing tools and frameworks and practices for others is where often you'll find that the mature end of the professional spectrum actually get most of their continuing professional development. So that's my view.
Thank you, Tristram.
I think what we're really talking about is giving people access to a body of knowledge that is constantly being developed. And that is of value to everybody, not just SMEs, but also, as you said, younger people in larger organisations.
Yeah,
and actually that sort of cross-fertilisation of ideas and making that body of knowledge available allows people, it brings in efficiency into the system. It allows people to not have to reinvent the wheel constantly, and sometimes some wheels don't get invented particularly well. And that will smooth the international trading system. And people will recognise when they've got a trade policy issue, a market access issue, or they've got a problem of access to finance, or whatever it happens to be, and they'll be able to work on that in a more efficient manner. So I think that body of knowledge, access to that body of knowledge, is the key thing. Yeah. Particularly now, where the knowledge base on international trade generally is not, how shall we say, as strong as it might be.
Very diplomatically put. In fact, we're going to be very rigorous in our approach to developing the GTPA. I mean, in addition to the certification process and all of the intellectual capital that'll come into that, there's already the intention to get involved in public policy advocacy, best practices development, and any related elements to this. For example, we recently submitted a paper to the UK's Trading Out of Poverty inquiry that's run out of the UK Parliament. So that's part of our vision for thoughtful engagement in the international market through a trusted network of professionals. Deborah, did you want to sort of add one or two comments on this point?
It might be useful for the audience to explain what GTPA is just a tiny bit more, because I don't know that they have a clue what we're even talking about. So maybe you want to, before you go deeper, you might want to explain what it is, and then we can discuss how it makes a network. Okay, well, this is how I describe it to people, and I hope it makes sense to others. I describe it, the vision, at least as I grasp it, is to create a group of trade professionals, of course, but somewhat similar to the way accountants work, where you have a CPA, a certificate of accountancy, and you continuously revise it, top up your training, and you have a set of courses and experiences that contribute to that, and then you keep moving in a certain way through these CPA courses. And the idea behind the GTPA is to have a network of people who have similar kinds of things across a broad spectrum of areas, including all sorts of things. I mean, I suppose the sky is the limit in a way, because it's brand new, in logistics or supply chain, or how to export, or potentially how to market, or trade policy, or all sorts of things. And the purpose of this really is to say that there should be a set pool of knowledge, like in the CPA model for accountancy, that everyone should have. And then you build on that, and you build out from there. And then if you have those credentials, people know that you as an individual have those experiences, you have that knowledge embedded in you, and that people who are offering those courses have some base knowledge that matches up with someone else's base knowledge. So we're not just taking courses that are just made up from I don't have any idea where, that are not compatible with anyone else's courses, but that they're sort of similar to one another, so that if you're hiring someone from the perspective of someone hiring, you can say, this person has done X, Y, and Z, and now I know what that is, because it's similar in Argentina and in Singapore and in England, and it's all exactly the same or similar at least, and we feel confident about that. So the idea is to give people this body of knowledge, to give them a network of people who have similar bodies of knowledge, and at least get everyone on more or less the same page. So that's how I describe the GTPA idea. And I think the reason why we need this is that we don't have enough trade knowledge in general, and the knowledge we have is, I would argue, in different places. So you walk around a place like here the last couple of days, and I've been hearing people who say, oh, we do that. And really, you do that? Where do you do that? And they'll say, well, we do that. Look, here's my 2-page thing on what we do. And really, I had no idea. I've been working with you for 4 years. I've never heard you do this. Yeah, we do this, and here it is. Then this next one goes, well, we do that. Well, what do you mean you do that? You do the same thing that these people do, and then you start looking at it, and they go, well, actually, you don't quite do the same thing. It's sort of similar, but not really. Then someone else goes, well, we do that. Well, for heaven's sakes, why are we all doing the same kinds of things? We should have some kind of common pool that we do similar, where at least we have some sense of who's doing what, and we start standardizing it in some way so that you can, as a person who is interested in building up your own knowledge, or someone who's offering trade courses or offering trade expertise, can turn to and find one consistent platform that has all of it. So especially if you are someone who wants to build up your own trade knowledge, you're an SME, and you want to build up your own knowledge, you know where to go. Instead of this aggravating, well, we do that, go find it. We do it, we find it here. Go search through my website and see if you can find it there, which is very annoying, frankly. So that's, I think one of the benefits of this is to have that network in one spot that has, where do you turn for trade knowledge? There it is.
And I'd add to that, because it's where do you turn for trade knowledge, but it's also where do you turn to service providers,
yes,
who are competent,
who would find, who would give you the knowledge that you need to build yourself up. Yes, because over the last day and 2 days now, actually, in these meetings, especially the ones on e-commerce, which is the ones that I've been attending a lot, lots of people keep saying, well, SMEs need to have the skills. They need to have the skills. They don't have the skills. They can't engage in e-commerce because they don't have the skills. And the expectation seems to be somehow that government will provide them with the skills they need to participate in e-commerce. This is crazy. Why should the government provide you with the skills that you need to participate in e-commerce? Why can't you, as a company, say, I'm missing these skills. These are the skills that I need to have. I mean, obviously you need to have basic skills, and the government needs to have a decent regulatory framework, and they need to deal with customs, and they need to have certain things in place that you as a company can't fix. But some of that skill development is on you. You're the entrepreneur. It's your company. You want to sell things. You need to figure this out. You need some kind of training yourself in order to build up your knowledge and your company knowledge and the people that you work with, their knowledge. Here's GTPA. We could start sending people through the system and build up their knowledge on trade. And that's, well, it should be, the onus should be on you. I want to sell more money. I want to make more money. I want to make my company successful. I send my people through the system. It shouldn't be government's responsibility to give me the skills that I need to be successful in e-commerce.
So I really like the way you've done that, and I'll take your advice and actually take a minute and elaborate one more element of GTPA, then Tristram, I'll turn it over to you. And that is that the process that we're following in terms of developing the GTPA is very stringent. So we're very much about using the ISO standard, we're very much about assuring a baseline of quality, and we have a board that guides the direction of the GTPA, and then underneath that board is something called the International and Technical Advisory Committee, which is meant to look at competencies and to look at technical aspects of the different domains that we'll be looking at. So if you think about anything to do with trade, for example, it could be anything as sort of intuitively that comes to you in terms of trade management or international marketing, anything of that nature. But it reaches into areas like trade finance and supply chain finance. It reaches compliance, regulatory, trade policy issues, and a whole range of issues across trade, including sustainability and inclusion, by the way, which is a little bit unique. And so we have this ITAC committee, which looks after that sort of macro view. And then relatedly, from a competency development perspective, we recently put an advertisement in The Economist, in addition to looking for people within our own respective networks, to create these working committees at the level of each of the let's say domains or subdomains. So there'll be a working committee on trade finance that will decide what are the competencies that we will be looking for before we certify a program or certify individuals to have reached that fundamental competency in trade finance or whatever the other areas, trade policy, so on. So those working committees will be very, very critical to the way GTPA evolves. And if any of you, if this resonates with you and you want to potentially contribute to the working committees, by all means reach out to any one of us, and we'd be very happy to talk to you about that. So I think that, to your point, Deborah, thank you for teeing that up, is I think that gives you a bit of a flavor for GTPA and how that's going to evolve. I'll just highlight again the advocacy piece. We'll be doing presumably some research on a number of topics that are of interest to our community, to our members. Then we'll definitely be advocating best practices. So there's definitely the professional development piece, but there's also the whole range around advocacy, research, and best practices. And that, I think, brings us to the point, Tristram, where I can turn it over to you to lead us into that professionalization discussion and how we're going to raise the bar for the practice of international trade.
So professions often evolve, and they sort of start out as artisan, technician, and then they evolve into professions. And really what sets them apart is a standardised set of competencies. And those are competencies and skills. So those become standardised, and then they become recognised, and then you can deliver them through various programs of education or information delivery. When we looked around at trade, and this is part of the dilemma with trade, trade's made up of law and marketing and policy, and there's a whole swag of disciplines that sit within trade. But they're peculiar in their nuance. And those peculiarities are their trade context. There was nothing out there that really delved in that. So we can look at the legal or the accounting or the marketing. They do have fairly standard sets of competencies. Sometimes they're jurisdictional, sometimes they're regional, sometimes they're global. Trade needs or should be global because that's the context in which we operate. So what we've done is we've looked at a framework that'll give rigour to that process, and that is ISO 17024, which is the international standard for the accreditation of individuals. And we've developed a program within the GTPA, and when we started out, we thought it was going to be pretty simple. We would just have a GTP, a global trade professional, and that was it. And then when we actually broadened the conversation, we said, well, in actual fact, we need domain specialties. We need people who are specialised in compliance and regulation, or law, or policy, or finance, or trade management, running exporting and importing companies. And then we looked at it and said, well, in actual fact, there's a whole career maturity that runs along that path, from students or foundation capabilities, through to practitioners, through to management, through to executives. And the skills and capabilities change as you move along that path, and the requirement changes. So that's how we've framed the competency sets. It's just made it a lot of work and quite large, but it then gives you the flexibility as an individual to identify where you sit and where you want to go. One of the things we mentioned earlier is that SMEs are time poor, and they often are resource poor, and they don't know they often don't know the skills they need, and they don't know where to get them. And that could be whether it's getting them as an education process or buying them in as a competency as a service provider, whether it be your freight forwarder or your bank finance or whoever. So where the GTPA is going is to say, well, we've now got a standard that we can start to accredit people to. As we register those, we have a directory of competencies, which is good for SMEs. We also have a directory or a certification of competencies, which is good for any employer who wants to know, as part of their recruitment process, what are your capabilities and competencies, and can they be independently verified? So I think one of the things from our perspective has been that, trade well, let me put it this way. Enterprises and economies are driven by the trade cocktail. It's kind of equal parts of education, inspiration, innovation and information. And you need to have all of those pieces to really drive an active trade program within a company, within a country. Hopefully within that trade cocktail it's just gently stirred, it's not shaken and it's certainly not left on ice. But if we can deliver, though, which is our intention and I'm fairly certain that we will, if we can deliver on those four things, on pathways to education, curricula or content, which we can then share across different jurisdictional bodies, if we can be a vehicle of information circulation, it's just that network of passing good information around. If we can somehow drive some inspiration amongst trade practitioners, inspire them to do some more learning or engage in different parts of the world because they now have access, then I'm sure we'll, by default, generate innovation within the export-import community, the global trade community. That will drive growth. That will drive growth at all sort of company sizes. And that's certainly our intention. And all of us sit on the advisory committee for GTPA, which is probably, well, not probably, it is the most critical part of the organisation because we have breadth across jurisdictions, we have breadth across disciplines, and we have breadth across sizes of corporate engagement. That diversity, I think, is, again, part of that deliverer of innovative improvement in what our global trade community does.
I really like this notion of the trade cocktail, and I think that's going to need to be some content. It's going to need to be content on the website at some point.
We need to label some bottles.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we're in Argentina. There's got to be a bottle of Malbec. We have to work that in somehow. Fantastic, Tristram. Thank you for teeing up that professionalization conversation. I remember in Sydney, we were getting together to discuss the launch and prepare some content and talk about the structure of the committees. And at some point, we'd been using this term professionalization of trade, and somebody very senior in the area challenged us a little bit to say, hold on a minute, actually trade's been around for a few thousand years, it's probably fairly professional already, and so let's acknowledge that. What we're really trying to get across with this notion of professionalization is really raising the standard and raising the bar, formalizing the discipline of practice, and as you said, moving it beyond the kind of informal learn-as-you-go model to really a structured, competency-based approach. So when we say professionalization, we don't at all mean to denigrate the history of trade. We all appreciate the value that it's created for humanity for the thousands of years that it's been with us. So
I think that's the difference between competency and professionalism. So we have lots of competent people. There's an enormous amount of competent people in this industry, and most of them are great people and they love what they do, and they love tax-effective travel and all sorts of, you know, international engagement. But what sets that apart is that lack of a standard or standardisation of skills and capabilities.
Agreed. So can I open it up to our colleagues on the panel around this notion of raising the bar? Your thoughts on how GTPA will contribute to that aspiration? Martine, go ahead. You want to?
I think you waste a lot of time, though, as an SME, trying to figure out what you don't know and gain the knowledge. And I think that this is one way that it might help you make your journey shorter, right? So one of the challenges that you have as an SME, as a founder in particular, is you start off, you have a great idea, let's hope you have a great idea, for a product or a service or something, and you think that you are headed in the right direction, but you've probably never had a business before, and you've certainly never done cross-border trade before, and you set off to go do something magical, and you don't know a lot of things, and so the journey for you to do all of those things is much more difficult, much more time-consuming. You make too many mistakes along the way, and you waste a lot of time, effort, and money in getting from where you are to where you need to be. And I think if you could shorten that journey and make it less painful and less expensive, that would be fantastic. So if this process helps you and others like you to shorten that journey, both because of the courses themselves, but also because of the network of people that you're with. There are other people who are also going through the same process with you, who you learn from, right? Because you're sitting in a room now with other people who are in the same space. And they can say, oh, you know, when I went to fill in the blank where, you know, when I started exporting to China, I learned the following things. Don't do this, definitely do that, avoid this at all costs. That's valuable. You know, it's not part of the course itself, but that networking with other people in that room is critical. And so it's the combination of those things that makes that journey as an SME so much shorter, hopefully, and so much less painful that I think it's very valuable in and of itself.
Thank you, Deborah. Martin, you wanted to jump in on this.
Yeah, I agree with Deborah. It's a journey from the workshops we are organizing at the university, the training programs. Well, we encourage the active participation of companies as speakers, and they tell us their stories so we can learn from mistakes, from the wise decisions, from everything. And I think that, you know, main takeaway was one of the sessions is that there is a contradiction between the type of results we are expecting from international markets and then the degree of professionalization we have inside the company. So there is a gap, I think, between the two things, and I think we need to find the ways to close that gap, and I think GTPA is such a great idea because it's closing this gap. And I think also when you raise the global bar and then you become knowledgeable in global skills, in global competencies, in best practices, you're going to be more prepared, in my opinion, to handle the particulars and the differences between different markets and different cultures. You know, if you share a common background with a network or with a client abroad, with a company, then it's a different type of conversation when you handle the particulars and when you manage the differences in those two things.
Yeah, you know, I was at Babson for 3 years, which is the #1 entrepreneurship school in the US, and learned a lot about entrepreneurs. And what's interesting about an entrepreneur is they know how to make their product, whatever it happens to be, their service or whatever it is, and they know how to sell it in a world where there are no barriers. What they're not very good at is figuring out what these barriers are and how to overcome them. And quite often what happens is, particularly as companies internationalize, which we're all constantly telling them, you know, export jobs, you know, are paid more and so on, you know, they hit these barriers and then the business fails. And it doesn't fail because they didn't come up with a good product. It doesn't fail because they didn't know how to market or they didn't know how to sell. It fails because there's something that they could not possibly have anticipated. And the number of businesses that fail because of market access type barriers. You know, when I was in private practice, we would ask the companies, what worries you today? What are the things that worry you in the world? And 70–80% of the things that worried people were trade barriers of one kind or another. And the ability to tap in, this is your point about speeding the journey up, yeah. If you can tap in to a body of professionals who can tell you you're going into market X and there's a law that's massively protective of your local distributor, and if you sign up with that distributor in 5 years' time, they'll hold you to ransom and they'll kill your business. If you knew that going in, your life would be so much easier. So, you know, I think it plays a huge role, and it's also specialization. It allows the entrepreneur to do what they do really well, and actually that specialization is incredibly important to just making the growing the economy and creating wealth and doing all these good things.
But I think part of that speeding up the process piece is, to quote an American vice president, you know, there are unknown unknowns, and if you have no idea, then you stumble through and you find the minefield. Yeah. Unfortunately, it's not often very, you know, sometimes you make it through. But if you can follow a framework that says, well, okay, there's a whole lot of things I don't know, you don't necessarily have to know it, but your ignorance is empowered because you now know that it needs to be dealt with, and then you need to find a competent service provider or someone, employee or whatever, partner, strategic partner, to deal with those pieces of the puzzle. And that, to me, is where that acceleration through the path comes, is taking unknown unknowns and making them known unknowns and empowering your ignorance.
So that, I think, positions us well for the next topic, and I'll just step back for a second and add a very specific reference to, from a raising the competency bar perspective, to tie in a little bit to the inclusiveness conversation. So I was in London a few weeks back, and there was an interesting observation that was made by one of the international, one of the multilateral bodies, said, look, there are some parts of the world where you have to convince a company to export. You have to tell them why it's important. You have to sell them on why they should bother to take the risks and consider the returns. And I will put my hand up and tell you very candidly that Canada, as much as it may not appear to be the case, is one of those markets where, particularly with SMEs, you really have to talk to them about why this is important, why that should be part of their strategic direction, and particularly if you want them to diversify beyond the United States, which now we have an entirely different set of reasons for having those discussions, but it's a market where you really have to have the discussion. The observation that was made was there are other parts of the world, and sub-Saharan Africa came up, South Asia came up, where the entrepreneurs get it. And not only is it a matter of they intrinsically understand the value of this, it's actually a matter of survival in some respects, where that's where you'll be able to feed the family, that's where you'll be able to advance the evolution of the community. So the ability to harness that energy and that desire to engage in international markets and complement it with professional competencies, I think, is one area where we will do a lot of good in terms of inclusiveness and in terms of sharing the wealth a little bit around the benefits of international trade. So I'll just leave that comment where it is, unless anyone from the audience has any questions or comments. By all means, again, I do invite you to jump in. But in the interest of getting you to cocktails as quickly as we can, Deborah, I'll turn it over to you to introduce maybe the concept of the network and the trusted network and why we think that's important in GTPA context.
Particularly for SMEs, I mean, I think one of the things that's hard about being an SME is that it feels lonely. It feels like you're the only one who's been going through this journey, and it can be challenging because you're so consumed with trying to build the business and not let it collapse that you often don't have this network, or the network that you have is not necessarily the sort of broad enough network that you need, and you don't always know, especially if you want to put yourself into bigger players. How do you do that? How do you find them? You know, there's a lot of different networks that you should have. You know you should have them, but it's very hard to do. So being a part of a network as you go through courses, for example, or as you connect to something like a GTPA, I think is important because it gives, again, it cuts that journey time down a bit. You know, the fact that you are part of something bigger is easier. The fact that you are part of a network that is diversified is really important, because one of the things that happens is you tend to focus on the network that is just your narrow area. And that's, in some ways, too narrow for you. You need to be out and talking to companies that are different from you as well, because they have experiences that are relevant. And if you want to be plugged in, especially now with supply chains being what they are, you need to talk to people who are in wildly different areas, because it turns out that there may be some synergies between what you do and what someone else somewhere very different from you does. And that's crucial. And you don't know that if you are just trying to muddle through the today. And so that networking opportunity, I think, is very important. And it's not just the people who are in your courses, it's also the providers of that experience. They have, or they should have, tremendous knowledge on their own, right? Not only of the trade topics themselves, but also of all the companies and all of the individuals and all of the experts, so that you should be able to go to someone and say, you know, I'm having this particular problem, and they should say, well, you know, hey, I know exactly who to plug you into over here because you know, we have this incredible network of providers as well who have certain kinds of expertise. So, you're having a legal issue on this particular issue in that particular country. Well, look, the GTPA network has X in it. Go talk to so-and-so. And that networking thing should be able to solve a lot of the problems that you face as well. So I think there are a lot of different elements attached to this that should be very valuable for participants in particular in the GTPA. Because it brings together trade professionals who are, you know, like a web, a global, literally a global web, which you don't get very often in this world, frankly, who can have the services that you need at the moment when you need them. I think that's amazing.
I think it's very powerful. And I mean, you might sense, ladies and gentlemen, that there's a certain amount of passion on this panel in favor of this topic and this initiative, but specifically around SMEs. There's a tremendous sort of instinctive focus on the benefits for SMEs. I want to pull that back a little bit and put that in a wider context for just a moment and just say that this is also very relevant to broader supply chains. So we very much also will think about this in terms of trading ecosystems, where the SMEs are fundamentally critical, and many of them are, you know, if you think about the way supply chains are anchored today, many of them are in parts of Asia or increasingly parts of Africa. And so there's that component to it. But this GTPA proposition will be, we think, equally important to large multinational corporates who need a healthy, robust supply chain, who need to ensure that their strategic suppliers are viable and are able to sustain business, and who need to think about things like their corporate social responsibility and ensuring that their supply chains are well managed and healthy and doing the right things. And so the ethical component of the GTPA raising the bar of practice will also be critically important in that discussion. Shanker, did you want to jump in on the network conversation at all?
Of the entrepreneur, or indeed the large business, to a successful result. So are set in stone, and that therefore business has to sort of find a workaround. And the workaround is usually quite expensive, and it usually raises their costs, which they pass on to consumers. And so the cost of the product goes up. And actually, if through this process one can educate businesses to actually think about their supply chains and actually think about where the costs in the supply chains actually are and why they're there, and then try to do something about it, either in, you know, like in meetings like this, in the World Trade Organization, or in regional trade agreements, or whatever it happens to be, you know, then we are collectively doing something very important for the world, because we're actually lowering those barriers, we're lowering costs, increasing capacity, increasing supply, and therefore, as I said before, creating wealth, which is ultimately, you know, what we really need.
I couldn't agree more. Tristram.
Just two quick points. One, I think in terms of the global supply chains, it's not just downstream, it's upstream as well. It's not just suppliers, it's customers. Making a competency improvement through SME customers of larger corporates. And that could be because they're, you know, the DHLs of the world and all their customers are, many of them are SMEs. Or it could be other channel partners. The other thing I think that is exemplified by the professionalised network is that most people in trade are good people and they like having fun and they're very giving. So we just ran a program funded by the Australian government, which was about empowerment of female entrepreneurs in the Pacific. So we brought 24 women who ran, and they were pretty dynamic women, but in very small economies. And so you can textualise that to say, well, look, you know, you're not going to move to the USA in a hurry. You're probably not going to get into Europe in a rush. But let's look at the market that surrounds you, which is Australia, New Zealand, ASEAN, and the North Asian nations, Japan, Korea, China. And within that context, we brought in a number of people to provide mentorship. I was absolutely surprised at the giving nature of really senior executives to actually give time. And they were great women. They had great ideas, they had great products. There was obviously variation in that. Some had different needs. I mean, there was a lady from Samoa who had, you know, they were third generation manufacturers of Samoan shirts. Problem is they're being killed by imports. So this 28-year-old woman who's taken over the business has said, well, I need to go the other way. So how do I do that? So I think that's part of that networking, is to access the very gifting nature of trade executives who will give back. And in the past, what's often happened in those economies is traders have gone in, taken the goods and milked as much as possible. But if you empower the locals to actually deliver their own goods into market, then they capitalise. So I'd be encouraging the Europeans to look at a similar program that we delivered in Australia to, say, the African states. I'd be encouraging the North Americans to look at a similar engagement with Central and South America, because I think that is part of what we want to do in terms of providing that network.
So the one thing that we haven't focused on, and then Martino, I'll come to you to see if you wanted to comment on this, but what we haven't mentioned explicitly, and we should have, is that we have a very specific point of attention around young professionals. So there's an actual stream that we intend to develop to effectively attract the next generation into this business and make sure we help provide a solid foundation as that next generation looks to trade whatever element of trade as a career, and we hope an avocation and a passion in terms of some long-term engagement. I'll tell you from personal experience, probably everybody who's involved in this event in some capacity or other has the same bug as I do, which is the international bug. Once you're in this business and it's taken you over, good luck getting out of it. I don't think it's possible anymore at that point. But we will be engaging the next generation and offering some of that, as you said, Tristram, some giving back from some of us who have a bit more grey on the roof to make sure that we pass some things along to the next generation. Martino, on the network discussion.
Just a quick comment. I think there is a way of being behind the scene. It's something that our small organizations need to understand. Being part of a supply chain is internationalization too. Okay, they have to figure out how to join supply chains, and once they are part of them, how to move forward, how to scale. Okay, that is going to be an issue of increasing practical value for SMS internationalization. I think we had a lot to learn from other regions, for example, Asian region, in terms of how the supply chains are integrated. I think our first goal should be become more regional through more integration with our neighbors, and then move to the next level in terms of being global. So that's fantastic content. Supply chain expertise is something we need in our region, in Argentina, and in our region.
Agreed. And the timing for this, I mean, for Argentina, the importance of the network, the importance of being able to engage in supply chains. And I learned yesterday over dinner that Argentina actually has 5 unicorn companies in the country, right, which is massively huge, given that you're just re-engaging in the international community. So I mean, that speaks very well to the entrepreneurial spirit of business people here.
One of the unicorns, was a participant in the workshops we organized at the university. There were, few friends in 2003, 4 friends, and now they are a unicorn. So that was an incredible journey, and they shared their whole story with us and how they prepare their company for to be international from minute one. It was incredible.
I'll tell you that those stories, as much as they're inspiring, they're kind of painful for me to hear because I've been self-employed for 18 years. And the last time I looked at my retirement plan, I'm on track to retire at 94. So it's going really well.
I think that's one of the advantages of the youth of today, because of the technology that's available. They are so much more globally connected. They actually think in that space, and I find that there's a lot more entrepreneurial spirit amongst youth than there has been for a bit of time.
Absolutely agree. So another reason why this is a tremendous timing to launch this initiative. Shanker, shall we wrap up with just a consideration of this idea of GTPA looking at trade from a holistic ecosystem perspective? And I think you wanted to bring in some policy angles around this for SMEs. So can I turn it over to you to take us into the home stretch?
I think, obviously, just not far from here, we're having a big discussion about SMEs, and there's a MSME paper. And I think it's very important as we have that conversation to think about, as everyone on the panel has said, the SMEs in the wider context of what they are. They don't sit in a vacuum. So this working group that's going to be established, hopefully will do some good. But if it regards SMEs as sort of operating in a vacuum, then I don't think that's the right way forward. SMEs don't sit in a vacuum. They are part of global supply chains. They service large companies. The interests of large companies in those supply chains and the SME interests often are the same. And what you actually want is you want those supply chains to work better, and you want those supply chains to offer more opportunity around the world. And how? So if you think about this in terms of what is the problem we're trying to solve, the problem we're trying to solve is that right now in the world they don't work necessarily particularly well. There are lots of trade barriers, not so much the usual tariff measures, but there's lots of behind-the-border barriers. There's lots of regulatory barriers. So, for example, we're having a conversation about domestic regulation as well. But no one is really saying, well, actually, a lot of those domestic regulatory barriers damage SMEs. They damage small companies that are trying to be licensed and so forth. So people don't necessarily always put these, sort of join the dots on these things. So that's, a very important area. So how do you solve these problems? Well, a lot of what you do to try to solve these problems for SMEs, for the supply chain, for the whole ecosystem, which is what is ultimately going to make everybody's life better, is by looking at, in the WTO, for example, but we could be having this conversation in Asia about trade agreements in Asia. We could be having this conversation about the Pacific Alliance or any regional grouping. Is it really, have we really knocked out all the barriers? Have we turned the world into that world where that entrepreneur just sees a completely free place in which their ability, their ideas, their hard work is what determines the result of their success, not regulatory barriers and contacts with government and so forth. Have we done that? Now, how do we do that? Well, if you look at services, and it's a huge volume of trade, it's a huge volume of businesses. How have we really liberalised services in the global context? And you look at the built-in agenda, for example, in the WTO, and you see very little progress in the last 20 years, either sectorally or actually in the built-in agenda. Why isn't that happening? Well, it's not happening because the demand from the business community as a whole obviously hasn't been strong enough to overcome the forces that prevent it from happening. Domestic regulation. Why aren't we making progress in this area? We're not making progress in this area because, again, the demand from people who see benefits to reducing those barriers is not overcoming the incumbent forces that benefit from the status quo. And so I think in terms of, so I think those are the things that you would want to see, whether you're an SME or a large company, or these are the things that will make supply chains work better, more efficiently, grow the economy, and produce all these good results. What's the role of an organisation like the GTPA in this, in making this happen? Well, I used to, just to give you a quick anecdote, I used to do a lot of work for a large multinational, so large that they had a hedging operation in Zurich. And what they would do is they would hedge the prices of various inputs that were coming into the business in Zurich. And the prices would be going up and the costs would be going up. No one would care. They would just hedge the prices. And what was the result of this? The result of this is that the costs were going up. The prices that they charged to consumers were going up. So they didn't really care. But that means that their market share was going down. And they were ultimately becoming less successful as a company. Now, they could have taken a different approach. They could have said, well, here is why our costs are going up all over the world. Here's the barrier in Indonesia or the barrier in wherever it happens to be. Can we create a demand to actually lower some of these things? Because if you can do that, then you actually transform, first of all, you transform the discussion here. there will be more of a sense of urgency. Over the other side of the road, I don't think you get that. I don't see a sense of urgency from our friends on the other side of the road. Well, that's because it's not their fault. It's because the business community is not really delivering in a real way that sense of urgency and not really realising what the benefits actually are. So I think part of what a trade professionals organisation can do is it can really upskill the ecosystem. So it's not just having trade policy people, it's having a business executive, fairly senior business executive, who says, you know what, I'm losing a lot of money because of these barriers around the world. And not just sitting there and saying, well, the world is set in stone and it's just the way it is. And that will change the conversation here. But more importantly, what it will do is it will change the world. It will change the regulatory environment these businesses face. And if you do that, then suddenly we're in a different world. So from 70 years of the GATT and the WTO, massive benefit to the world, huge increase in global GDP and so forth, billions of people lifted out of poverty. But we are now talking about the new normal, as if this sort of stalled level of growth is what we are basically left with, and that, in our view, is not correct. It's not. If we lower some of these other barriers that we're not making any progress on, then I think actually you see lots of growth, and thank heavens for that. Anyone who goes to an emerging market or a least developed country and you say, well, this is the new normal, you're just not going to grow anymore. That's not something that people want to hear, and it's not true. So. Part of this challenge of how you answer this problem is to really professionalize the business world about the impact of trade barriers, regulatory barriers, lack of competition, and that if you can do that and you can create an army of people who are actually recognize what the problems are and what they can do about it, then I think you've done a lot of good.
So I'm going to do the typical Canadian thing and add an optimistic comment around our friends across the street, which is this is the first time in the history of the WTO ministerial where there is a business forum running in concert with the WTO ministerial. In fact, all day today was the business forum where we had some very top-level CEOs and some senior members of government in the same room in the cultural center across the street here to actually start that conversation. John Danilovich, Secretary General of the ICC, was there. We had a number of CEOs from Argentina, from a couple of the large companies here, PepsiCo, Monsanto, and a couple of others who were in the room trying to then engage, and I have to say that Director General Azevedo was one of the early speakers. This is answering his call for business to engage much more closely with the WTO. So I'm optimistic about this development, and I suspect that in future ministerials we'll see that pattern which Argentina started repeat itself. So I think that's good news. I really appreciate the way you've positioned your thoughts around barriers and regulation and tied in the GTPA. So I hope we've given you a flavor for the variety of perspectives that are at the table at GTPA and persuaded you that there's something really compelling in this proposition. Just given that it's about 20 after 6, what I'll do rather than open the discussion on this last point is I'll ask each of our panelists for one final observation or recommendation or comment on the GTPA that you'd want to leave our colleagues in the room with, and then what we'll do is we'll at least invite questions if there are any, and if they're not, then we'll see what vintage of wine is being served downstairs. So maybe, Tristram, I'll start with you for that final observation comment, if I could.
So I think one of the great dilemmas of monoliths is they're very hard to move. And one of the things we've tried to do within the GTPA is to not be a monolith, but to set a framework that then is delivered locally rather than globally, but use the network capacity to deliver information, content, curricula, whatever, into a local context. So we are looking to establish chapters across the globe, which will deal either regionally or just within the jurisdiction that they reside. And I think in the early stages they will be regional, but it might be that there's one in Argentina and one in Uruguay, and they will deliver in their own jurisdictions. To me, that is the power of being able to break down some of those barriers to say, well, here's a global framework, but let's really get active at local delivery.
Okay, thank you. Martin, over to you for one final thought or observation, please.
Final thought. Well, when you talk to companies here in Buenos Aires, Argentina, especially small companies, perhaps they don't have a definition about what international business is. But when they start telling you what they do, you can perceive the holistic approach, the holistic view, right? What they have in their minds is at least a system with 3 components. They have strategic planning. They have operations, which is, for some, is not the whole picture, it's part of the picture, but extremely important. And market development, how you sell and how you engage with clients abroad and develop a relationship. Basically 3 components. And I think at GTPA, we are speaking the same language. We are speaking about being holistic, and especially important if you want to be an international business executive or an international business manager. Your job is going to be dealing with different departments at your organization, and you have to understand all perspectives, try to integrate them, and try to introduce change inside the organization. So international business managers are change leaders in the organization. So it's extremely important to have, as a manager, the holistic view of trade. And I think GTPA is helping with, achieving these sort of skills, competencies. So it's totally welcome, the initiative.
Excellent. Deborah, over to you.
Well, I think that the team, and Tristram especially, and Lisa, who's not in the room, but have done an amazing job of putting together an enormous amount of material. But because the program is new, there's still some room for improvement and for more input. So, please, I would beg people, really, to get involved and to supply your 2 cents or more to make sure that the program, as it evolves, actually satisfies the needs. Because although you've got a lot of people who are in the committee who are helping develop this, the more input you have, the more likely it is that the final product actually satisfies the needs of people who are involved in the product. So I think it's really important, especially at this early stage, that we get as much feedback as possible from people. So I encourage you to find the materials. Their written materials are somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Down at the cocktail party?
Yeah.
So at the cocktail party are written materials that describe this in more detail. So please pick that up, please read it. And then give feedback on that, because it's really important that we get as much feedback as possible to make sure that it matches the needs of people who actually might take the courses, provide the courses, participate in training, whatever, to make it the best program it can be.
Absolutely. And do think about reaching out to us about the working committees. Again, as I mentioned earlier in our discussions, we are looking to staff up additional members of the working committees, and the number and the nature of the working committees will evolve over time as well. So do reach out to us if that's something that you're interested in doing. Shanker, do you want to wrap it up for us?
I would just say, I'll just echo the call to engage. I mean, obviously, people have made an investment to come to MC11. Obviously, you therefore think that trade is important, and engage with this. See what you can do with this, and regard it as an investment in your own companies, in your own careers, and in your own futures.
Excellent. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'll just open the floor for any questions, comments, observations. Sir, do you mind? Can I ask you to just identify yourself and your organization?
Sure.
Thank you.
My name's Jerry Ho. My name is Jerry Ho. I'm the Deputy Chair of Small Business Advisory Group, advising New Zealand government. So we're cousins from Australia.
There you go.
Yeah, but one thing we understand that we have more than 600,000 small medium businesses in New Zealand, and some of them doesn't have the export mindset. And also, it's kind of a challenge for us to talk them, to be export focus. Also, I would see GTPA will have some sort of challenge in terms of getting the number, in terms of small and medium enterprises engagements, because they will say, yeah, that's a great idea, but how do I get involved and how do I sustain, and more importantly, result-driven? That's how I see it. And that's my question. How do you see the model that you work with governments in terms of, say, for example, GDPA working with New Zealand governments and also associations to stimulate the models and participations from small businesses? Thank you.
So that local delivery piece is about sort of setting up chapters across the globe. And those chapters will be a mix. In some jurisdictions, they will be government. And if you look at the Italian Chamber of Commerce, I mean, essentially that's almost a government agency. In other cases, it'll be organisations that are membership-based, driven by the industry. We're pretty open because every jurisdiction has different cultural contexts, different reasons. They could be educational providers, but we will be engaging educational providers at least to ensure that we can identify the content that they deliver that actually matches the capabilities that are required for trade. So I think the answer is a bit vague, but because we need to maintain a really broad range of flexibility. I mean, I'll talk to you afterwards, but and in many cases, if you take an Australian and New Zealand context, it possibly won't be government, but it might be government supporting the introduction to the right organisation and maybe even supporting. I mean, we'll get some announcements this evening. We have a government that is prepared to put money into, particularly out of the aid context, into some jurisdictions in our region. They won't set up the chapters, but they will provide the resource to allow those chapters to develop.
And I can even see a scenario where the multinational could persuade their SME supplier community to engage. We see this very regularly in the finance world, where we had this discussion offline before the panel, where SMEs, particularly in emerging markets, face very, very expensive funding costs. And one of the mechanisms we're working with through the ICC is to give the SMEs access to funding at the costs that would normally be attributed to their large multinational buyer, which is massively lower. And so I can see for something like this, competency development and market engagement, that a large buyer could serve as a kind of a magnetic pull around getting the SMEs involved. So I think there are a couple of paths that we could follow to address the concern that you raised. Thank you for the question. Anyone else? Yes.
Hi, good evening. My name is Cristina Vallejos. I'm from Ecuador, but living now here in Argentina. I worked last years for the government of Ecuador, for the Ministry of Industries. And 1 year ago, it was signed in Ecuador the commercial agreement with the European Union. And one of the big challenges that we had, it was the small and medium enterprises, how to help them to get into this big agreement that for Ecuador it was a big opportunity to get with products into the European market. And one of the big issues that we saw, it was the small, medium enterprises. They didn't have the the barriers that the market has. They don't want to deal with all these issues in order to get into those markets. And even for the domestic market, sometimes they don't want to fulfill all the regulations and requirements. So this becomes a very difficult issue to manage for the government, because the government doesn't have enough money to fund this kind of capacity building. So I saw this as a very important tool for the professionals, entrepreneurs, to help these communities to get into the international markets. Because from the experience from the government, I have seen that there are not the capacity, especially in our countries, the capacity to help the small and medium enterprises. Usually in 1 year, we trained probably 100 companies, but there is not enough material to give them. So I really congratulate for this initiative. I think that it will be very helpful for us. And something that I thought that it is very important, it is to secure that the could be accessible for our countries, because sometimes there are a lot of platforms that the cost for get into the platforms are very cost, and sometimes these small companies, they don't have the facility to access. So I again congratulate, and I saw this a huge opportunity not only for small and medium enterprises, but also for professionals in our countries. Thank you.
So, Christina, which committee will you be joining? Thank you for coming, and we should talk about that. But so you're absolutely right. So one of the things that we are talking about at the board level, I know, and in the management level of GTPA is how do we engage with the LDCs and the developing and emerging markets in a cost-effective manner. So we have a pricing model. I think it's public at this point.
Yep.
But there's also some discussion about ensuring that it is, to your point, accessible to the LDC. So we're very sensitive to that point.
And one of the things that, and working to deliver on that, is actually then working with developed nations to fund that. So I actually had a conversation yesterday with someone from USAID who's saying, I think they're based in El Salvador, and they're saying, look, you know, we have this massive issue within America that, you know, we see trade aid being a solution to, but we don't know how to deliver it. And we're saying, well, come and talk to us. And in actual fact, they want to come. He approached on the basis that he wanted to talk to me deliberately about how can we help them. And there, again, it fits the model because they're not only looking at the companies, but they're looking at border control. There's a whole lot of border control issues. How do they improve that? How do they improve some of the finance issues that are particularly in the trucked cross-border trade rather than the shipped cross-border trade. So USAID, I'd be giving them a call and being very nice to them because I think well, he did say to me they had a bucket of money. Now in Australia, that means that you've got an awful lot. It doesn't mean that you've got a 5-gallon bucket.
But so I was going to validate with you. You did say USAID, right? So I feel oddly better here. I feel like my neighborhood in the world is going to have there's some hope there to have that kind of thought process. Look, ladies and gentlemen, I don't want to cut short the discussion. It is after 6:30, and we do need to get downstairs for the launch event. But please join us for a glass of wine, and let's continue the conversation there. Please, would you thank my fellow panel members for their participation on the panel, and thank you all very much for staying with us this afternoon.